So as we continue into part 2 of DC versus Marvel, this is where we begin to transition away from our discussion on heroes and villains from the DC universe who have been transported to Marvel and those from Marvel who have been transported to DC, and we start getting into battles between the most prominent characters from both DC and Marvel. But the first thing we get here is a little bit of explanation. Now, I'm actually taking this out of continuity in the story because this is given to us later in the story, but I think that at the beginning is a really good place to put this. What we're told is that, unbeknownst to us as the reader, at the beginning of all things, there were basically two brothers. One brother represented the DC universe and one brother represented the Marvel universe. And the result was that while they were relatively aware of the other's existence, they simply chose to ignore each other. The problem is that because they were two halves of a whole, each one desired to be unique and to be whole in and of himself. The only way for them to do this, or seem to be able to do this, was to basically battle one another, and the loser would have their universe wiped out. And so that's exactly what they've done. They've basically created kind of a battleground using the characters of the Marvel and the DC universe, and they've chosen to pit them against one another, and whoever loses basically loses their reality. Now, one distinction to make here is that this is not a battle to the death. This is simply an instance of proving who's superior. So all that's really necessary is for one hero to knock out the other in order to gain the victory. So, Thor doesn't have to kill Shazam. He just has to overpower and knock him out. And so you're going to see that in the story. You're not really going to see, characters killing each other. You're going to see characters knocking each other out. Now, the reason behind this is something that I'm not 100% sure of, because finding interviews from writers, from Peter David or Ron Mars, who wrote this story, it is difficult at best. And so there really isn't a definitive explanation coming from either publisher on why this decision was made. But if I had to hazard a guess, I would say because this was targeted towards kids. And, even though the Comics Code Authority wasn't really in existence, even though there weren't really rules on the kind of content that comics could display in terms of violence, there was still just sort of a social contract. There was just a measure of decorum. You couldn't have characters just killing each other arbitrarily. Not only that, it was difficult for fans to make a distinguished difference between what's in continuity and what's out of continuity. And so if in this story Wolverine had died and then he showed up in the Marvel universe, prospective readers would have been like, well, what happened? Why is Wolverine not dead? I thought he died in Marvel versus DC. And so, for that reason, again, I'm just kind of speculating here. I'm just sort of spitballing with you guys. In truth, your answer is as good as mine. But after this exposition is given to us, we basically pick up with Wolverine and Killer Croc battling one another. Now, this is really just, again, another situation of these characters just fighting. just these characters battling. This is just, again, showing us that Marvel and DC, the switch that's taking place, is requiring these heroes to cope with their own situations. From here, we actually end up jumping to Thanos. And Thanos is, again, just monitoring the fluctuations of the universe itself. Now, what we're told is that Thanos is actually sort of happy about what's happening here. And the reason why is because, again, this is a point in Thanos' history where he's constantly trying to appease Mistress Death, and he's constantly trying to end life as best he can in order to make Mistress Death as happy as he can. And so to see the universe fluctuating presents two scenarios. One, it presents the ability for him to rise to power by capitalizing on the confusion that everyone's experiencing, and two, it allows him to use whatever these fluctuations are for the purpose of just destroying the universe and everybody in it, which again would go towards making Mistress Death happy. The problem is that while Thanos is analyzing this, Darkseid shows up when a boom tube opens up. Now, we don't immediately find out what happens between these two, but I will say that later on down the line, the Infinity Gauntlet gets involved, which is, it's both really cool, but it's a huge letdown at the same time. But from here, we jump to Captain America and Bane. Now, the Captain America and Bane section is, again, just a segment of the comic, just a segment of the battle between the two. This is designed to show us that the two of them are simply just going at it. They're still fighting one another, and that's basically what this is. It just gives us small little highlights, here and there between these two characters. We switch to, we switch back to Wolverine and Killer Croc going against one another. And as the two of them are battling, they're basically being watched by Dick Grayson. Dick Grayson is watching this entire series of events unfold. And from his perspective, as Nightwing at this point in time, watching over Bloodhaven, he's just kind of like, okay, this is pretty wild, but, it seems as though even if Killer Croc is a bad guy, if this dude with adamantium claws, or I guess, from Dick Grayson's perspective, metal claws, is tearing through, Killer Croc, it may be this guy is worse than Killer Croc. But what we also know is that while Dick Grayson is watching these events unfold, that Gambit is sneaking up behind him. And so from here, we switch to Storm and we switch to Wonder Woman, and it's simply just the two of them encountering encountering each other for the first time. Now, what we end up doing is we actually switch back to Captain America and Bane, and this shows us our first victory of the story so far. One interesting thing that happens with DC versus Marvel, and something that we'll see a lot, is we'll see heroes being defeated, or, you know, individuals attempting to defeat heroes using moves that they were most prominently known for. For example, with Bane, he tries to break the back of Captain America in the same way that he broke the back of Bruce Wayne. But there's huge differences here. Captain America's no pushover. Granted, Bruce Wayne is not a pushover, but Bruce Wayne doesn't have super strength. Captain America does. And this is exactly what happens. He immediately overpowers Bane while he tries to break his back, and he simply just knocks him out when he throws his shield, and it comes back and it hits Bane in the back of the head. Now, again, this is just another example of how Marvel and DC are playing the story fast and loose. You know, we just kind of have to assume that the shield was thrown. We know that Captain America recalls his shield whenever it's thrown, and that's it. That's all we get. He just knocked out Bane with his own shield. I know a lot of you guys would probably want a little more in terms of explanation. I know you guys would probably want a little more in terms of, well, how does this all work? It's not designed to be that way. This story is designed to be just action. It's a fan-based story. And so what happens is we switch to Bruce Wayne, and you know, at this point, Batman is basically watching, you know, the Lizard, Doc Connors, analyzing this skyscraper, trying to get a grip of his situation. But while this happens, Dick Grayson is taken by surprise from Gambit. And so the result is that, you know, Bruce Wayne basically sides with Dick Grayson and ends up going to save him instead of keeping an eye on Doc Connors. But what we learn is that while this is happening, while they're distracted with what's going on, you know, while Bruce Wayne is checking on Dick Grayson to make sure he's okay, Gambit and Wolverine steal the Batmobile. And again, the question we would ask as readers is, how did they get past the defenses? You know, surely the Batmobile has defenses to keep anybody from, you know, anybody except for those approved by Bruce Wayne from using it, but somehow he was able to take it and he was able to use it. And in the end, it doesn't matter because again, this is all just fan service. This is all just what happens in this crazy situation. And so with Gambit and Wolverine taking off, you know, the question is, with this vehicle being as powerful as it is, being as fast as it is, you know, maybe they can get back to Westchester, maybe they can get back to Charles Xavier, and they can find out everything that's going on. Instead, we basically end up switching over to a combination of different things. What happens is we basically pick up with Jubilee and Tim Drake talking to one another. We pick up with, you know, this explanation from Access basically telling us that this dimension, you know, this wall, this barrier that's supposed to exist between the Marvel and DC universes is becoming weaker and weaker. And the result is that because these brothers have noticed each other, because of the fact that these brothers are now fighting one another, that in the end, it's basically collapsing everything around them, and all these heroes are going to have to fight. And this is essentially just Access, you know, becoming aware of the entire battleground that these brothers have made for the Marvel and DC characters to fight one another. But from here, we basically switch over to Thor and Shazam. Now, this was actually a really interesting scenario to me. And the reason why I say this is, for those of you guys who are not familiar with Shazam, he is a character who derives his power from the Greek gods, so to speak. You know, he's got the strength of Hercules and you know, so on and so forth. The idea is that Thor represents the other half of this equation. Thor is, you know, the son of Odin. And so it's like seeing these two European gods battling one another based off European mythology. And there's a kind of respect that exists between the two of them. You know, they're simply not just fighting one another arbitrarily. Instead, because they are so powerful, they actually take time to pray, you know, before they actually engage in a conflict. And so while they're doing that, we basically switch back over to Thanos and Darkseid. In my mind, these two were probably the most anticipated battle of the entire conflict, because in the eyes of fans, Thanos and, you know, Darkseid are effectively the same character in two different variations. And this is how it exists for a lot of this conflict. You know, Deadpool is basically, you know, Marvel's version of Deathstroke. Lobo is DC's version of Wolverine. You know, the characters are all influenced by each other. You know, they're designed for different reasons, but in a lot of ways, Marvel's copied DC, DC's copied Marvel. And that's one of the reasons why this series was so derisive and why so many fans read it, because fans of characters wanted to see their characters win. And if their characters didn't win, they would get angry. And that's one of the reasons why Marvel and DC actually allowed fans to vote on the outcome of some of these conflicts. But instead of initially battling one another, Thanos and Darkseid actually take wagers on who would win, you know, on who would come out on top if the two of them were to fight each other. And so from here, we switch back to Thor and to Shazam. And the two of them were engaging in a pretty, extreme battle against one another, a pretty monstrous battle. And with Thor and Shazam, we would expect it to be that way, just because of the fact that with his hammer, with Mjolnir, Thor is a force to be reckoned with. But Shazam is no pushover. Shazam is effectively as powerful as Superman, depending on the circumstances. And so it was really just kind of a toss-up to see who would come out on top here. The result is that while they're in the middle of fighting at a carnival, and when the Ferris wheel collapses onto Shazam, he ends up shouting the word Shazam, which turns him back into Billy Batson. Now, for those of you guys who are not familiar with Shazam, he was created after Superman in the 1940s, but he proved to be more popular than Superman in the 1940s, and it was actually because of a lawsuit from DC that Shazam disappeared for 20 years. And by the time he reemerged, while he was originally called Captain Marvel, Marvel Comics already trademarked Captain Marvel with their own character, and so DC started calling him Shazam. But whenever it is that Billy Batson, the teenager, yells the word Shazam, he's bestowed with his powers and he becomes the superhero. But there's pluses, there's benefits and drawbacks to this. The first is that if he shouts Shazam as Captain Marvel in this situation, he'll turn back into Billy Batson, which allows him to get out of tight situations. And this is exactly what happens. With the Ferris wheel collapsing on him, he shouts Shazam, he turns back into Billy Batson, and he gets his way out. The issue to this is that if he were to shout Shazam again, he would turn back into Captain Marvel. But all somebody has to do is stop him from doing that. And so the result is Thor does this. Thor basically takes away Billy Batson's ability to say his name again, and he seems to effectively be knocked unconscious. The issue here is that his hammer, Thor's hammer is knocked out of his hand, and when that happens, Wonder Woman happens along and sees the hammer. And when she goes to pick it up, it seems as though she's going to be successful in lifting the hammer of Thor. But before we find out, we switch to a conflict between Namor and Aquaman. Now, this is a trend that I hope you guys are noticing. Marvel and DC are basically giving us situations where characters who are almost identical in nature are fighting one another. Namor and Aquaman are basically it. They are two halves of the same coin. Of course, Namor was actually around before Aquaman, but the fact remains that each have their own legacies and their own histories in their own right, but they both hail from the sea. They're both kings of their own dominions undersea, and they're both kings of Atlantis. And so the result is that while those two are initially going against one another, we end up switching over to the Flash, to Wally West, and to Quicksilver. Now, this is one of those instances where the question is asked, who's faster, the Flash or Quicksilver? Now, at this point in time in Marvel and DC Comics, this was a legitimate question because there were instances where Quicksilver was extremely fast, wildly fast. And because they had never met, because they had never crossed over, there was always this question being raised. Now, at this moment right now with like DC Rebirth and New 52, so on and so forth, we know Barry Allen is much faster than Quicksilver. We know Wally West is much faster than Quicksilver. In Final Crisis, Barry Allen outran death. Quicksilver's never done that. This also took place before the storyline when Wally West outran the universe. And so this was a legitimate question back then as to which one is faster. And of course, the guns are really stuck to here in the sense that despite Quicksilver being as fast as he is, he's simply no match for Wally West. Wally West is just way too fast in terms of his speed, and he easily dominates, Quicksilver. He takes him over pretty fast. It's really not a huge contest here. And so what we end up doing is we switch back to Aquaman and to Namor the Submariner. And initially the conflict seems pretty even between the two of them. The conflict seems pretty straightforward. The issue here is that Aquaman possesses an ability that Namor does not. Namor, is king of Atlantis. He does have super strength. He is a human Atlantean hybrid, but Aquaman has the ability to communicate with sea life. Now, that's kind of where I'm going to leave it because I know it's a very touchy subject when Aquaman fans hear people say that, because Aquaman fans, will routinely say he doesn't talk to fish. Whether or not he talks to fish is irrelevant here. The fact is that he basically communicates, however it is that he does it, with an orca whale, and the orca lands on top of Namor the Submariner and seems to incapacitate him. And so from here, we basically switch over to the end of the comic. And what the end of the comic does is it reveals a few things. The first is that we are going to see Thanos and Darkseid fight one another. But the second and the most important thing is that Wonder Woman is successful in lifting the hammer of Thor. And this is a huge deal because she's actually the first character that we've ever seen outside of Marvel Comics to lift Thor's hammer, something that a lot of us didn't actually think would be that she'd be capable of. But in any event, again, like the last video, post a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think about this one so far. I'm kind of curious. And yeah, this series was really fun. The issue is, I'm kind of a stickler for explanations, and I'm a stickler for exposition, and this story is more action than anything else, and so it's it's kind of hard to explain a lot of the things that are going on behind the scenes. But in any event, guys, I'm gonna go ahead and bounce off here. Make sure you hit the sub button if you're new here, become part of the Rob Corps, drop a like and leave a comment. Let me know what you guys think, and I will catch you all later. Peace.